I am pleased to introduce Dr. Steve Windels, our first presenter today. Dr. Windels is a wildlife biologist at Voyageurs National Park in Minnesota. He has been a professional wildlife biologist since 1996 and is certified through the Wildlife Society. In addition to long-term studies of beaver ecology, he has conducted research and monitoring on moose, white-tailed deer, wolves, muskrats, eagles, loons, cormorants, and more. He is the 2023 recipient of the Distinguished Moose Biologist Award, the Wildlife Society's Jim McDonough Award in 2021, and the National Park Service's Director's Award for Natural Resource Research in 2014. Please welcome Dr. Windels.
Thank you. Appreciate the introduction. Let's see, going to share my screen. So the title again is Beavers and the Creation of Habitat and Increasing Biodiversity. But we all know the title should really be Beavers Are the Answer. The question is irrelevant. Hashtag selfless promotion. This is the bumper sticker that I made many years ago and has been slowly circulating its way around the world. So let's play this game here a little bit. So when I say the question, I want you all to say to yourself or to your office mate or text your mother the answer. Okay, the trade of what animal basically fueled the westward expansion of the United States? Everybody's got that one. What is far and away the most handsome rodent in our solar system? Okay. Everybody's saying it for themselves or out loud, right? What is the only animal that can break the deadlock in Congress and pass a clear appropriations bill to keep the government fully operational after October 1st? I think we know there's only one person or one animal we can call. So Emily gave a great overview last week about beaver engineering and all the ways they do it and all the ecosystem services they provide. So I'm just going to give just a few slides here. Giving just some really quick background about these things again. So beavers build dams to create ponds. And let's see here, I'm going to try to. And beavers don't just like water, they like stable water. So this is why they build dams. And some of these dams are very large. Here's one that's probably 7-8 feet tall. Here's another one. This one's almost 12 feet tall. This is the famous Helms Deep Dam here in Voyageurs National Park. That's me on top for scale, and I'm a very tall person, so that's a huge dam. So a typical pond site, after they construct this dam here at the outflow, you're going to again have, here's the lodge and the food cache and the canals. Emily again talked about the canals last week, the channel or the tunneling that beavers do and digging the canals, which is sort of an understudied aspect of their engineering so far. Again, part of the reason why they build these ponds, build a dam to create a pond, to create the stable water level. So here is a side view of a beaver lodge. Okay, so here's your classic, typical beaver lodge. There's the underwater entrance. You can see the food pile, the food cache. Obviously, the farther north you get, the more important and the bigger that food cache gets, and the farther south you get, for example, Alabama or the Gulf states, they often sometimes don't have any food cache, but in northern places like this is what gets them through the 5 or 6 months of winter. So the lodge provides protection from predators. This is a key one. Once again, these lodges built with mud and sticks, and once they freeze, they're like cement, really hard for anything to get at them. Protection from the elements. Location of the food cache. And again, this is an underappreciated aspect here that basically water in the wintertime is usually just slightly above freezing, 33, 34 degrees, and essentially it acts like a heat pump. And so again, even if it's minus 30 and minus 40 Fahrenheit, it will be above freezing in the lodge. Just again, some brief natural history. Beavers are highly territorial. They're monogamous, but are they? It's up for debate in some ways. They live in family groups. They have a breeding pair. The kits, the 1-year-olds. Sometimes you get some 2- and 3-year-olds in the family groups as well. And in dense populations, you have delayed dispersal. Very similar to European beaver in ecology and behavior. They're totally different species. They have different numbers of chromosomes. They can't interbreed. Again, they're all the same, except European beavers wear nicer shoes and own less guns. Beavers are herbivores. You'd be surprised how many people still think that beavers eat fish or clams or whatever else. Again, they are almost strict herbivores. And again, an underappreciated part of their biology is that they eat a lot of aquatic plants. And we did some really cool work here about 10 years ago now, summarizing some of that. Okay, so yeah, now coming back around to thinking about beavers as ecological engineers and even keystone species, and what do these terms mean? So again, the internet is a strange place. So if you want to find a picture of a beaver wearing braces driving a train engine with a tooth on it, you can find that. But that's not exactly what I meant by engineers here. So ecosystem engineers, again, as Emily highlighted last week, create or modify habitats by causing physical state changes in biotic or abiotic materials. And keystone species are species with a disproportionate effect on ecosystem whose removal can lead to collapse. And again, this is based on this concept of a keystone in a stone arch. If you remove that keystone, the whole arch collapses. So we all know about this game, 6 Degrees of Kevin Bacon. I know we've all played it. Some of you probably played it on the way to work this morning. Where again, with just 6 connections, you can connect any Hollywood person to Kevin Bacon. Okay. You can do the same thing with beavers, 6 degrees of American beavers, and instead of actors, it's all of the ecosystem processes and functions and roles that they play in our ecosystem. It's a game I like to play here. That I challenge people to name something in the, some ecological function or species or whatever, and I can connect it back to beavers for 6 degrees. And that's here. They're dam building, they're foraging, they're lodge, and they're catch building, and also beavers with prey. So beavers, again, as ecosystem engineers and their effects on biodiversity and all of these other things, this has been lots of papers and books that have summarized this work very well over the years. And I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to go and give you a whole overview of all of these potential things that have been talked about for beavers, both American and European beavers across the globe. So instead, I'm just going to focus on what I've been doing here at Voyageurs National Park for the last 20 years, specific to beavers as creators of wildlife habitat and what that means for biodiversity. So here's Voyageurs National Park. This is in northern Minnesota, right on the Ontario border. So we share almost 70 miles of border with Ontario and Canada. It is the only national park in Minnesota. And it's primarily, we call ourselves a water-based park because that's the main mode of transportation. We don't really have any roads. People come here and either using powerboats or using kayaks and do a lot of camping and fishing and hiking and that sort of thing. Okay, there are a lot of beavers in Voyageurs National Park. This is, I described this park is sort of, again, the mecca for beavers in the United States. It's the highest known densities in the United States. There are certainly places in Canada that have higher densities of beavers, but in terms of the lower 48, this is it. And the densities here are at least 2 to 10 times higher than what have been measured almost anywhere else in Minnesota. So there's so many beavers here, in fact, that it almost should be a theme park just for beavers. So yeah, this is just an idea that has come to me from time to time. If there's any producers out there, you know where to find them. But here, so what I want to show you now is I'm just going to walk you through this really great work that Phil Johnston and Bob Naiman and some of her collaborators did starting back in the 80s, where they picked, again, this spot in Voyageurs National Park with a known very high density of beavers. And they went back and they looked at aerial photos that were available, and they could track through time as beavers recolonized this part of the park called the Kabetogama Peninsula. And as their populations expanded, again, we can now watch their influence on this landscape increase over time. And it's just, again, some of you who are on this webinar have probably seen me give this time series before, but those who are seeing it for the first time, it always is a little bit eye-opening. Okay, so 1927 was the first available photos that we had for your crappy black and white air photos taken as part of the border survey. But at that time, basically, very few beavers on the landscape. You can see from that time series in the upper right, the little red dot sort of tracks where the population was. Very, very few beavers out there. They'd all been basically trapped out. Here we fast forward 1940. Now 1% of the landscape has been affected by beavers. These are either active beaver pods or variations of beaver affected environments. So old ponds or beaver meadows or flooded shrublands, all those different categories of beaver affected wetlands. 1948, again, this is now we're really in this sharp increase in population size. 4% impounded, 1961 there's 10%, 72 we're at 11%, 81 12%, 1990 13%, and the last time we looked at this was in 2005, again 13%. So impounded. Again, it's just a really, this was kind of, they were the first ones to really do this, and it's just a really great case study in what you have when you add and subtract beavers from the landscape. So again, if you just think about this, so what the Catatonia Peninsula, that's this big chunk in the park, looked like in the 1940s, basically with very few beavers, versus what it looked like in 1990 after just 50 years of beaver recovery. And what the landscape looks like now is probably very similar to what it would have looked like again in the 1500s before the fur trade era started and beavers were populations went in the tank. So here's another example. This is just a little snip from the northeastern part of Voyageurs National Park. That's Ryan Lake in the left there. And so in 1940, again, this was mostly forested. Again, we jumped to 2013, and again, here's this landscape mosaic of beaver wetlands with the standing water in them, with old ponds that are now some sort of form of beaver meadow, or again, things with wet soils or flooded woodlands. Again, a whole mosaic of that was created here just by beaver activity. So here's another look at this. Again, just to show you at various spatial scales what this means in terms of creating a diverse landscape with different habitat types that might be appealing for all kinds of different wildlife. And one of the things that is common here, again, in the area that has had persistent beaver activity and foraging, is now you have sort of this bathtub ring of conifers that you find around a lot of these ponds, conifers that beavers really aren't eating. And you have to go further inland to find the deciduous species like aspen and birch, for example. And again, as Emily talked about last week, again, whatever, even if you zoom down now just to the spatial scale of an individual pond, you can see the heterogeneity that happens at the pond scale as well. So you have so here's the pond with lots of aquatic vegetation growing in it, things like water shield and those sorts of things. And now beavers, their activities through their digging and their feeding are cleared out these little donut holes around their lodges, and you can see the little channels where they've been swimming or digging. And again, now beaver activities have created this heterogeneity even at this scale, and which creates obviously that much more opportunities for other animals to exploit. So what I'm going to talk about again for the next number of slides here is a summary of this chapter from the book that Carol wrote, Beavers and Boreal Ecosystem Engineers. This is the last chapter in the book, Beavers as Engineers of Wildlife Habitat, and it was really just summarizing everything we knew here at Voyageurs National Park going back to 1973 when the park was established to up to 2016 when the book was published about various wildlife species that interacted with beaver created environments here. Okay, so one of the first ones we'll talk about, and one of the ones that I've focused a lot on in the last 20 years, is moose. So beaver, thinking about beaver ponds as moose habitat, moose require heterogeneous landscapes. They need all kinds of different cover types and vegetation types to fit their different life history needs, whether that's foraging or thermal cover or escape cover from predators, calving areas, etc. So beaver ponds can provide some of these things. Very escape from predators. Obviously, it's pretty hard. Moose are great swimmers, and it's pretty hard for a wolf or a wolf pack to swim and keep up with a moose and feel it in the water. So moose in the water is actually much less vulnerable to wolf predation than outside. Also escape from biting insects. There's lots of there's moose flies that are just really nasty and drive moose crazy, and they spend a lot of time in ponds in some places just to escape when the flies get down. Moose are adapted to aquatic feeding. This is a Canadian thing, so no offense to the Canadians, but they sometimes call them swamp donkeys. They have these long legs and have this long snout. Again, it's the adaptation for part for feeding on aquatics, both emergent and submergent aquatics. And some of the work from Windels was the one that documented this, Paul Peterson and his colleagues. Observing moose diving as deep as 5.5 meters and staying submerged for 50 seconds to forage on aquatic plants in wetlands out there. So I had a student working with me from Lakehead University. Brian McLaren was his advisor, and where we looked at beaver ponds as foraging habitat for moose, and this was an important thing in Ontario was they were trying to work this into their forest plans about retaining beaver ponds and potentially moose habitat. So for a couple of summers, David was here swimming around in beaver ponds, and as I'll allude to later, that it was interesting watching him change over the course of those 2 summers. So we measured depth in all these different ponds that we had, the study ponds, and mean depth was 1.13 meters, and so which meant moose could readily forage throughout all of the portions of the ponds. It was just like these beaver ponds almost everywhere was a pretty good spot, potential spot for moose to forage. We also measured richness and biomass of these aquatic plants, foods that we know are moose food. There's 2 to 4 times higher richness and biomass of these moose foods in beaver ponds and in lake wetlands, for example. So really, again, potentially rich areas for supporting moose. And the richness of plant richness was greater in young and medium-aged ponds. By the time they got to these old ponds, they sort of hit this quote-unquote climax stage that were just less diverse. There's greater richness in larger ponds than smaller ponds, and I won't get into why that was. But so one other thing that we were interested in terms of moose, they're a large, dark-furred animal, and their range basically, we're almost at the southern edge of their range here, right in northern Minnesota, and that southern part of the range is limited in large part because of their adaptation to cold climates, not warm climates like we have. So moose, anytime they're moving around, again, they have this complex heat budget that they're trying to navigate. So we thought about, again, trying to, here at Voyageurs, think about what's the thermal environment for moose. And one of the interesting things we found is that these open areas where beavers had removed the trees or where there were no trees or through various activities, these open areas could be as hot as 8 degrees Celsius warmer during midday in the summer than closed canopy forests. So what that means, if we think about this sort of on a landscape scale now, so this is, again, essentially the thermal regime for this Capitogama Peninsula that we took on, just the average the hottest part of the day and the hottest part of the year, just to give us sort of the maximum amount of difference here, just for example. So in this case, the red areas are the warmest and the dark green areas are the coolest. And again, in all these cases, a lot of these red areas are beaver complexes. These are areas, again, where beavers have come in and flooded and killed the trees and removed the overstory. And now essentially creating these very warm areas. So if you're a moose and now you're going to have to go out in the middle of the day, you have to make some decisions about what that means for your own heat budget now. So here's an example. So this is midday. Again, this is just one example for illustration purposes. And those red areas, these are all beaver ponds, basically. All the red stuff is beaver ponds, and the darker stuff is forest. So here in midday, this is the hottest part. But now, here's the interesting part of this. If we switch now to midnight, so 12 hours later, essentially the coolest part of the day, these areas now are cooler than in the forest because it's just easier for heat to dissipate. So it's one of the things that we looked at is our moose moving back and forth between these open areas during going into the closed canopy forest during the day and then coming out into these open areas, a lot of them beaver wetlands at night to cool off. We also thought about beaver ponds as thermal habitat, so the water itself. The moose go in and use these areas to cool themselves down. We had temperature loggers put out on a number of ponds. And the story is complex and it's unfinished, but one of the interesting things here, so this is mean maximum air temperature that we measured adjacent to these ponds over the course of 3 months, one summer. So that the top line there is the maximum air temperature, the bottom line is the minimum air temperature. And you can see it vary quite a bit on a day-to-day basis. So the interesting thing is when we measured water temperature, the maximum water temperature in these things was pretty close to the maximum air temperature. So so during the middle of the day, for example, when the water is essentially the same temperature as the air, is that really an opportunity for moose to cool down? And again, where it gets more complicated is because the high specific heat of water means warm water might actually cool more than warm air. Again, if you think about it, if you sit in 85 degrees air temperature, you're going to be sweating. If you sit in an 85 degree swimming pool for enough hours, eventually you're going to get hypothermia. That's just the way heat transfer works. And again, this stuff is unpublished, so I will be on the next episode of Porter's Agency Biologist in season 20, where I think a lot of you can empathize. We're really good at collecting data and sometimes not so good at getting out the door. I think if you look way in the back on the left, you can see that that's where the folders are for this study. All right, one other thing, interesting thing that we looked at, this was not the focus of this, but we were interested in understanding about parasites in moose, both liver fluke and meningeal worm, which the meningeal worm has been in the news recently because of some work that's been done up in Grand Portage about understanding effects of meningeal worm on the moose decline. But one of the interesting things is that for liver flukes, the snails that are the intermediate hosts for liver flukes live in wetlands. And obviously beavers have now created lots more wetlands here in this park than there were 100 years ago, for example. What does that mean for the risk of moose getting liver flukes? It's again we still don't quite know what the answer is, but it raises some interesting questions. Beavers and gray wolves. There's been a lot of work done here in the last 10 years on wolves and wolf behavior and how they prey on beavers. Again, those of you who may follow the Voyageurs Wolf Project in more recent years have kept up on that stuff. But beavers are, again, what main prey items for wolves, especially in the summertime. 50% of their diet can be comprised of beavers. And wolves will use beaver ponds and meadows as travel corridors, especially in winter. So again, just thinking about beavers creating habitat, not to prey themselves, but even just creating habitat for wolves that facilitates their movements for whether it's preying on beavers themselves or preying on other things like deer and moose. Wolves also will den and abandon beaver lodges. We have a couple examples of that from here, which is always fun. And the obligatory photos of wolf pups that I managed to shoehorn in here, but in rendezvous sites, so wolves actually love to use these beaver meadows as rendezvous sites. They spend most of the time on these sites in June and through August and stash their pups here while they're out hunting. These are open spaces and tall grass. It seems like they're great places for predator avoidance for those young pups when they've been left while the adults are out foraging. Obviously, lots of other mammals will use beaver-created wetlands. Some of these are not a surprise: muskrats and otters and mink, coons, especially bears. And there are examples here from Voyageurs of bears using abandoned beaver lodges as winter dens, lots of other small mammals. So I'm going to go a little faster here, and that's 24 minutes in. So bats is another one. All 7 species of bats here in Voyageurs have been documented using beaver ponds. And so bats are attracted to forest openings near water sources, where they like a high abundance and diversity of flying insects. And exfoliating bark on tree boles provides excellent roosting habitat. And bats or beaver activity creates all of these kinds of things. So there definitely is a lot of it. That's part of that reason for why bats are often highly affiliated with these beaver creative wetlands. Same sort of concept, woodpeckers and cavity nesters. Anytime you come in and you flood an area and you kill standing trees, like in the photo there, these trees are going to start to break down, and this is just great foraging habitat for woodpeckers and also for cavity nesters. Here's an interesting one. Trumpeter swans were reintroduced in Minnesota in 1986. Again, I came here in Voyageurs in 2003, and over the 20 years that I've been here, the number of trumpeter swans that we see using the park, mostly during migration, it's just gone crazy. But of all the known breeding attempts that we've had here in the park over the last 20 years, all of them have been in beaver ponds. This is just these areas that swans really seem attracted to. Again, it's anecdotal, but again, it's illuminating in some ways. Great blue herons, same thing. 100% of the rookeries in Voyageurs National Park that were documented from 1973 to 2013. So this is 31 rookeries that we had been monitoring. Park staff had been monitoring since 1973. All of them were in beaver created wetlands. And again, in this case, what often would happen with beavers would flood black ash lowlands, and those standing black ash trees would die, and then they were great nest substrate for great blue herons. They really like these. Osprey is another one. So we had almost a 40-year record of looking at osprey nests here in the park, and more than 80% of the nests were in beaver impoundment. And part of this was that bald eagles had increased during that same time, and there was some competitive interactions that we think bald eagles sort of chased ospreys out of the lake habitats, and then ospreys moved inland, and the next best thing was the beaver impoundment. So in the absence of those beaver impoundments, I'm not sure if we would have had very many ospreys at all. So here's how long do these dead trees persist? And this is a little bit anecdotal because it's kind of hard to find this information. But so once the wetland gets flooded, and now you have these standing dead trees, how long do these trees stand there and provide habitat for, again, even nesting substrate for herons or osprey, or even foraging habitat for other ones? So being able to look back at some air photos and some other evidence that we had 6 ponds where we could find some evidence going back 25 years or more. And 6 out of the 6 ponds had at least 30 dead trees standing after 25 years, which is a long time to go. And in at least 3 cases, in at least half of these cases, at least 3 standing dead trees in a few ponds up to 66 years after creation. So that footprint that is left by beavers after creating that pond, again, can persist for quite a while and creating this habitat opportunity for some of these birds in particular. So now again, if we think about a beaver pond, at that smaller scale, and this is that heterogeneity you see. So here's dead trees in the littoral zone over there, where you might have some submerging plants and floating leaf plants, in the shrub zone, in the emergent zone, the beaver meadows. So these are all different now sort of habitat types created in this one pond. And for birds in particular, you're going to have different birds that are going to like some of these different zones more than others. So we found 77 species of birds using beaver created wetlands. That's almost 30% of the breeding and visiting bird species at the park. Amphibians and turtles, this is no brainer. Everybody knows this one. Obviously, these things don't like to use wetlands. But what I want to talk about here is there's a student, a PhD student at the University of North Dakota named Alan Stamen. He has probably the coolest name ever as far as a wildlife person might go. But he's looking at amphibian and invertebrate communities in beaver created wetlands. So we've got 55 different wetlands of different sizes and ages. So he just finished his 4th season of data collection. He's going old school. It's just Alan by himself. He doesn't have any field assistance. He wants to do this sort of, he wanted to create a project that he could do just with him and be by himself, just using acoustic recorders for the amphibian work and then dip nets for this invertebrate community. So be looking for some of these results from his stuff coming out in the next year as he finishes up. So similar to that other student, David Morris, what I watched over the 2 years that Dave was here and then with Talon is that each year that they spend engrossed and swimming around in beaver ponds, they start to look more and more like beavers. And I'm pretty sure that Talon actually chewed that tree down here last year. That was one of the last things that he did. So it's overall what we found is 124 terrestrial vertebrate species used beaver created habitats here in Voyageurs National Park. That's 38% of the total extant vertebrates. I didn't include fish in this. That's all of it. Work that was done by Ag Schlosser here from UND, if you're interested. But it always makes me think of this cover from the New Yorker, where all of these wildlife species living happily together here in one beaver pond. But so the take home that I want you to have from this again is we go back to 1940 and we have this landscape with low beaver density, and again, go to 1990 or even the present day with this landscape with high beaver density, and what the difference between those two. And again, we can just go back and think about what that may have meant for all these other species that I just talked about in terms of either their presence or their abundance or their breeding success or all of those things. So over the last 70 years, 90 years, whatever, wildlife diversity certainly has increased here in the park as a direct result of beaver activity. So I'm right at 30 minutes and I'm going to try to wrap up. I think I only have maybe 4 or 5 more slides. I apologize for talking fast, but I want to try to capture a lot. So here is, this is a beaver pond. You can see the little low-hanging dam in the front, and there's a beaver lodge in the background. This is in Tierra del Fuego down in South America in Chile. And these are beavers released from fur farms back in the 50s and now are this ecological catastrophe in parts of the Tierra del Fuego and Chile and Argentina. But so I was there last year, which was amazing. I got to see beavers in Tierra del Fuego, but in a beaver pond, there were 2 Chilean flamingos. So I dare anyone out there to top this. If you see any flamingos in a beaver pond here in North America, I would love to hear about it. So far I'm winning. All right, last thing I want to talk about is beavers also build lodges in large lakes, and I've spent a lot of research effort over the last 20 years focusing on this. So again, 40% of the park is large lakes. Some of these lakes are huge. Rainy Lake is one of the biggest, the 60th biggest lake in the world. This is a huge environment with a lot of shoreline that beavers will exploit. They don't build dams, but they'll build their lodges on the shores of these lakes and do all their same beaver stuff. But again, what you have, it has been talked about before, is if you think about, again, the beaver lodges themselves as now habitat for other things, either because animals are going to use them for roosting or loafing or resting, or you have now all of this wood that's piled up either for the lodge or for the food cache that now at various stages becomes habitat for aquatic macro vertebrates, small fish, et cetera, et cetera. So here's the distribution of beaver lodges over a 14-year period. Just on the big lakes, all those little yellow dots are lodges that I've documented during this 14-year period of the study that I'll talk about. And one of the interesting things is there's various hotspots now of where there's these clusters of lots of beaver lodges. And some of these lakes, like Rainy Lake and Mannequin Lake, are very lakes with low productivity. And so now you have biological hotspots created essentially by beaver activity. So one other example, so beaver lodges as muskrat habitat. So this is something that I started to notice when I started working with beavers here 20 years ago, is how often I would see muskrats swimming in and out of beaver lodges. And this is beaver lodges that are occupied by beavers and beaver lodges that have also been abandoned. So muskrats and beavers seem to have formed some kind of détente where they tolerate each other inside these beaver lodges, mostly because they're not eating, their diets don't overlap that much. So we had a study where we put game cameras up because we wanted to sort of document how frequently this would happen in beaver lodges with muskrat habitats. And got lots of cool videos of muskrats swimming around, coming in and out of beaver lodges. So in this camera study, which is not published yet, but muskrats were more than 2 times likely to use beaver lodges than random sites. So again, these beaver lodges were great getting habitat essentially for muskrats rather than building their own lodges. They would take advantage of one of these hundreds and hundreds of beaver lodges that are various stages that are in the that are here in the park. And in another case, we had a translocation study where we were moving muskrats around and they had transmitters because we were doing another experiment. And the survival rates of those muskrats that used beaver lodges were higher than those that did not. So that was a really interesting finding that we had a couple of years ago. So this is a shot of a beaver swimming, and I don't remember what I was going to say about it, but I'm sure it was going to be some iffy way for me to summarize all this, but maybe it'll come to me later. So just want to acknowledge again all of the folks that have worked with me here at the park, either park employees or university collaborators and more on various components of this stuff. So I'm at 35 minutes. So what I'm going to do now is here's my shameless self-promotion. So I'm writing a novel, tentatively called Being Bruce, about where the protagonist is Bruce, and Bruce may or may not be me, or at least what my inner thoughts are. So, and when this is published and I'm famous, I promise I will still talk to you all. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
Well, that was just lovely, Steve. We do have a couple of questions in the